This is an idea which first hit me last year about a section of the Haggadah that troubled me for years and years, and I never really got it. And then last year, I was able to put something together based on a comment that the Nitziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, makes on the body of Midrash called Mechilta. And very quickly, you have all the sources in front of you. I will not read through them inside, just in the interests of time. But towards the end of the Maggid, as some people may be wandering into the kitchen to check on the food, and some people are wishing they could wander into the kitchen to check on the food, and people are thinking, all right, enough already, let me get to the food. You get to the math portion of the Haggadah, right, in which we are told that every plague that struck the Egyptians was really 4 plagues or 5 plagues, and they had 200 plagues at the sea or 250 plagues at the sea. And I don't know what in the world you're talking about. What does this math game mean? Who cares how many there are, and where did you get your numbers from? And yes, there's a way to calculate it, but it's very hard to understand. And it's hard to understand what in the world this is doing in our Haggadah. Not to mention the Rambam doesn't have it in his Haggadah. You know what else the Rambam doesn't have in his Haggadah? He doesn't have Dayenu. I don't know what they sang. There's no Dayenu in the Rambam's Haggadah. Dayenu existed in his day. We have it in Haggadahs that are earlier than his, in Sephardic lands. So why doesn't he have Dayenu? Why doesn't he have this? So to make a long story short, because I've given this shir as a 45-minute to an hour shir, it ain't going to be right now. But to make a long story short, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin points out something fascinating within this. If you flip to the second side, I'm sorry? Number 7? No, that's not the one I want, but thank you. No, you're not going to go number 4 on the bottom of the first side. This is a good, quick example. The Midrash in Shmos Rabbah, talking about what happens at the sea and the way that they all suffer 200 plagues, 250 plagues, whatever it is, caps off the discussion by quoting a verse from Tehillim, from Psalms, in which we are told, Noda Hashem Mishpat Asa. God is known, He has performed justice. And this is the way that the Midrash introduces what we have in our Haggadah, which is in source number 2, about the 200 and 250 plagues. What happens is a form of justice. What is the justice? So the Nitziv writes, it's in source number 3, that people at the sea experience different things in the water based on what they had done to the Jews in Egypt. Those who were horribly cruel to the Jews suffer miserably in the water. Those who were better to the Jews suffer less in the water. And that's an idea you've probably seen or heard referenced at some point in relation to the song the Jews sing after the Egyptians drown, right, in Az Yashir. Because there we are told, on the one hand, that they sank like lead, but we're also told they sank like stone, but we're also told they're thrown about like straw. Which is it? So if you flip the page, you find another Midrash in source number 5, in which we are told that it depended on who they were. Those who were better to us had one treatment. Those who were harsher to us had a different treatment. There's a lot to discuss about number 5 in particular, but it's totally beyond the scope of where we're going to get today. But the point is that the Nitziv suggests, flipping you back to source number 3, the Nitziv suggests each of the pursuers of Israel met an unusual death, which is why he points out at Mariv, in the evening service, there's a blessing which notes, Es rodfehem v'es sonehem bishamos tiba, that God drowned the rodfim and the sonim. A rodes is a pursuer. A sone is an enemy. Why do we characterize Egyptians as pursuers and enemies? Suggests Rabbi Berlin in his commentary. Because some of the Egyptians pursued us because they hated us. And some of them pursued us because it was their job. They were in the Pharaoh's military, and they showed up one morning and they were told, today we're going to clean out the stables. And they showed up another day and they were told, today we're going to pursue the Jews. And they went and did it, and we don't excuse them for it. They get punished for doing it. Saying I was just doing my job is not an adequate defense. But it's not as bad as the person who volunteered. The person who said, I want to go out and do this. And that person suffers, in fact, a different fate. And so what the Nitziv suggests is that each of the plagues that occur at the sea, when we say that each plague was 4 plagues or 5 plagues, what we're saying is that God struck each one in kind. Each event that took place was different for different people, to strike them measure for measure, which he uses to explain an interesting anomaly in the verses that lead up to Az Yashir. The verses that lead up to, that lead up to Az Yashir, to the song the Jews sang at the sea. The verses that lead up to it say that the Jews saw the mighty hand God had brought against the Egyptians. And then they trusted in God. It says they feared God. The word in the Hebrew is vayira'u, which can mean fear or reverence, but in context the Netziv takes that one as fear. They feared God, and then they trusted in God and in Moshe, his servant. So the Netziv asks a series of questions. He says, number one, why not say that the Jews saw what God had done for the Jews, and that caused them to believe? Why are they motivated by seeing what God did to the Egyptians? How about the fact that he split the sea and brought us through on dry land? That should count for something. That's number one. Number two, he says, if what you saw is that God destroyed your enemies, why did that make you afraid? That should have made you feel pretty good. You have a pretty good defender there. And number three, why is it that they only believe now? They saw 10 plagues in Egypt. They saw fire and ice coming down from the sky at the same time. That they didn't believe in. This they're going to believe in. Why now do they believe? And so Rabbi Berlin suggests, and that's the part that's in source number 7, but I'm not going to read it aloud. You can see it there. He says that the idea is not that they're impressed by the might of what happens at the sea. They saw divine might already back in Egypt. What they're impressed by is the measure for measure, because it says to them that God is watching what goes on in this world, and counter to what we see on a day-to-day basis in our own existence, there is some form of justice. And the one who your Egyptian neighbor, the guy down the block, or whether he's your neighbor or not, but the guy who whipped people suffered in this way. The guy who enslaved people but didn't whip them suffered in a more benign way, did not have to go through the same thing. And he says that is what they see here that they didn't see in Egypt, number one. Number two, it's why it says that they were impressed by what God did to the Egyptians. That's what impresses them. And number three, it's why they're then afraid. Because once you recognize that there's a God who's watching what everybody does, you start to think, well, what has God been watching of what I did? It's not necessarily a happy thought. When we learned Treyasar in previous years, we saw several prophets who said, beware, you think you're praying for a wonderful day of Mashiach and things are going to be great and everyone's going to get lollipops. It doesn't always work that way. As far as Maimonides omitting this, so to make a long story short, Maimonides seems to believe, and it's based on source number 9, Rav Herschel Schechter is the one who points this out, Maimonides believes that the purpose of the Seder is to talk about what happens on the night of the 15th of Nisan, the night we get out. Because that's what we're told to speak about in the biblical verse in source number 10. Talk about what I did to Egypt. And that's what we do. We talk about the events of that night. So therefore Maimonides leaves out this, because this is about what happened at the sea. And he leaves out Dayenu, because 3/4 of Dayenu is about after we leave Egypt, giving us the man in the wilderness, right? Bringing us to Har Sinai, giving us the Torah, giving us Shabbos, bringing us to Israel, building a temple. Those are all posts. So therefore Maimonides says that's a great song, but it doesn't belong at your Seder. Whereas the justification for including it now may be, because this actually completes a really good arc. The first mention in the Torah of the Jews going down to Egypt is when? Sorry?
Do you want to say Beit?
Yeah. When God speaks to Abraham and says, your children will be strangers in a land not their own. Vavadum v'inu osam arba me'os shana, going to be made to work for 400 years. V'gam es hagoy asher ya'avodu dan anochi. But I'm going to judge the nation that did this to them. Arc is now complete, because it's not judgment with the 10 plagues in Egypt. There's no direct justice. I mean, the Midrashim point out, measure for measure, the Egyptians did this, and therefore this happened to them. There is something, but the true measure for measure is what happens at the sea. That's what completes the arc. Yeah?
It completes the arc, but it's also, the argument we have, like, the Holy Rosh Chodesh, I assume Rambam said that, but his point is no, we're only focusing on what happened that night.
But Yachal Me Rosh Chodesh is only to prepare for that night. It's about telling the laws, I should say, of. So my last point on this, really, I'm going to leave hanging here because I don't have a good answer for it. I believe this is an important part of our Seder, as part of Higadat Levincha, the mitzvah of telling our children about what happened in Egypt. So part of telling them is telling them that there was this shining moment in time when God actually punished the bad guys and saved the good guys. Whatever you see around you, the chaos that we perceive in the world around us, there are moments like this at which you can actually witness a divine hand, and you can see incredible things in this world. And that's a very important piece of what we convey to our children. It's not just about what happened when our nation was formed, although that's important, but it's also about our experience in the world today. The part that I'm going to leave you hanging with, because I don't have a good answer, is, do we really have to tell our children this through a negative, through the punishment of the Egyptians? Wouldn't it be really great if we could convey to them this message that sometimes you see the divine hand through good things happening to good people, as opposed to bad things happening to bad people? And the only answer I have for it is, unfortunately, we don't have a record of a particular moment in time of good things happening to good people that we can use as a great example. But that's not a satisfying answer for me. And so that's something that I leave you with to think about. Have a wonderful Pesach. Chag Kasher v'Sameach.